Welcome to our fifth episode of the piXL Drone Show. And this week we have an amazing guest who is going to be talking regulation with us. So I want to welcome Haye Kesteloo from DroneXL. I want to welcome Kara Murphy. And our guest is Loretta Alkalay. And Kara, introduce our guest because you know her a lot better than we do. And then we'll let Loretta tell us a little bit more about herself.
Okay, so Loretta is probably one of the most well-respected aviation attorneys around. So very honored to have her here. She was with the FAA for 30 years as an attorney, and she is now an adjunct professor at Vaughn College of Aeronautics. And also grandmas who drone. No, I'm joking about that last part. But I'm just amazed, especially in the women's groups, whenever anyone has a drone law or policy question, Loretta's there to answer it with the most accurate information. She is just one of the go-to people on drone policy and regulation. And obviously her experience at the FAA and now as an adjunct professor at Vaughn College speaks to that expertise. And so welcome, Loretta. I'm so happy that you agreed to come on.
Oh, thank you. Well, you're one of my favorite drone people, and I'm very happy to be here. I have been listening to the podcast, so they're really very interesting. And I'm happy to have an excuse to talk about drones, which is my favorite topic.
So, Loretta, tell us a little bit more about your background. I know Kara just covered some of this. What got you into aviation and going with the FAA that long ago? Because this was, when the FAA, especially is a long time ago, and you, I'm sure did not start with drones, obviously. So, do you have a background in airplane fixed wing as well?
No, I'm not a pilot. I really am interested in the law part of aviation until I got into drones. So I went to NYU Law School, which was one of the few law schools in the country that had aviation law. And I had a great professor who had negotiated some of our initial aviation treaties. And he was wonderful. And I interned at an aviation law firm, and from there I went to the FAA. And back in those days, the government was a lot better for women to work for than private law firms. And once I had children, it really was a lot better. So even though we worked a lot of hours because we were always understaffed and overworked, and we had a large responsibility for aviation safety in the New York area. I was head of the legal office in New York. We had 7 states in the District of Columbia. We also did enforcement abroad. It was really much friendlier for women than the private sector. And then I retired as soon as I could because why not? And I do consulting work, and I started teaching at Vaughn, and it was actually my students that got me interested in drones. And then it changed my entire career focus, basically. I still do aviation consulting, but mostly work on drone issues. And I fly drones.
Then, Loretta, I got an interesting question for you. I know that you live in the same neck of the woods that I do in Westchester County here in New York. And of course, with Manhattan being so close by, that would be an amazing place to fly a drone and get all those amazing aerial shots of the New York skyline. But I understand that we're not allowed to fly in Manhattan. Can you tell us a little bit about the law that restricts us in that regard?
Yeah, there's decades-old aviation law that precludes any takeoff or landings that aren't from designated airports or approved by the Department of Transportation for the city. So even though it's not it wasn't really intended to preclude operation of drones when it was written, it's been used that way. And the New York City police can be really aggressive. So you don't want to risk getting arrested or even misdemeanor citations, because now having any kind of criminal record, especially in aviation, can basically preclude you from working in so many places. So yeah, it's really an unfortunate law, but there are some people that are working on changing it.
Do you think it's something we might see change anytime soon, or?
Well, the security agencies are very opposed to it. So I think that you'll probably continue to see exceptions and waivers and maybe a formal waiver process. But, I mean, people do fly in New York City. It's just not always done legally.
What's the airspace in New York City over Manhattan? I'm actually not familiar with the area at all. Is there a controlled airspace out there as well?
Yeah, parts of it are Class B. And of course, now that we have a new administration, we don't have the presidential TFR that we had for a long time. So over Trump Towers, that TFR is gone. So, but there are still sections that are Class B.
Interesting.
Loretta, I remember our Women in Drones talk for Boston Drone Film Festival. That was so wonderful to be on a panel with you. And maybe this is obvious, remote ID is overreaching, but you made a really interesting statement just about how it's especially unnecessary for Part 107 certified pilots. And I was hoping maybe you could elaborate more, just given your depth of experience.
Well, I do think remote ID is extremely overbroad, and I think that it's very intrusive. And I am glad that Race Day Quads has sued the agency because I would like to see it limited. So remote ID is great, I think, for integration in the national airspace system, but there's very little reason for it when applied to small commercial operators and recreational flyers. And there's real security issues with the remote ID, as you know, identifying either where the controller is with the human that's attached to it, to anyone with a cell phone, and the broadcast module identifying the takeoff and landing, which is going to be pretty close proximity to any pilot. And we know that there's been harassment and worse of drone pilots. But I think that when you talk about government overreach, I mean, when you think about a child who's flying a drone that's over half a pound, they're not going to be able to fly in their own backyard unless it has remote ID, which is ridiculous. I mean, I have land upstate New York, which is remote and isolated, and I think it's ridiculous to require remote ID, which would then allow every hunter in the area to identify where I'm flying from. So I think that there's a lot of constitutional issues. I mean, the government's going to be sucking up all this data about where you're flying, and they're going to know. So even though any individual with a cell phone can locate the drone and the person flying, law enforcement is going to be able to actually correlate that with the individual. Now, I mean, there's a lot of First Amendment issues, Fourth Amendment issues. I mean, it's really incredible government overreach. And the drone community, other than the FPV people, have been incredibly silent and accepting. And I have two theories on that. One, my theory is that they don't know the law and they don't understand it. My other theory is that people have no intention of complying with it. So to that extent, I mean, I don't think people are registering their drones anymore. According to some data from the FAA, 1 million drones fell off the registry. Now, the FAA claims, they were old and people didn't renew, but I think that when the registration expired, I think they just didn't re-register them.
So I've oh, sorry. I don't want to cut you off, but I have I wanted to bring in the concept of UTM into this, because the FAA has come up with this concept of unmanned traffic management, and remote ID is a part of it. The FAA wants to see that all drones share their location. And to me, it's a great idea in concept. I'm not going to lie. I like the idea because coming from the manned aircraft world, that's kind of how it works over there. But the fact what you mentioned, flying below tree lines, for example, where you say, the FAA shouldn't have coverage right there, or shouldn't have control of the airspace. I think we talked about this before we started. But the concept of UTM relies on remote ID, and integrating larger unmanned aircraft into the airspace is the goal down the line. That's the reason why the FAA wants to go with UTM in this entire concept. What I'm getting to is, in your mind, based on your experience, and based on the fact that larger drones, delivery drones, autonomous, beyond visual line of sight drones are coming into our airspace, how do we integrate them without the concept of remote ID?
Well, I mean, if you're a pilot, then, and I'm not a pilot, but GA pilots or GA aircraft don't need ADS-B in uncontrolled airspace. So I think that there are solutions that don't require every single drone to be either have remote ID or required to fly in FAA designated areas. Community-based organizations like the AMA, you can't just go fly at an AMA field. You have to be a member, and you have to be a member of that field. So, you can't just go show up and fly. And schools, I don't think, are just going to let anyone come fly on their property for liability reasons, tax reasons, all kinds of issues. So it's going to really limit people that don't have remote ID, which of course is the purpose of it. But I think the government can come up with their airspace where you could fly without remote ID, locations, altitudes. I do think you need remote ID for integration. You need it for UTM, but I don't think every single recreational or small Part 107 pilot needs to be flying like that.
Yeah, I got a question though. I mean, when the FAA proposed the rules for remote ID, they had about 53,000 comments from all kinds of people from the drone industry and the drone community. I mean, ranging from people from DJI to all the way to hobbyist drone pilots. I was surprised how quickly the FAA was able to analyze 53,000 comments and keep pushing forward with the rule with very little adjustments, it seems, to it. Can you tell us a little bit about how the FAA, how they would process so many comments and how they might change their rules and how that process works in general? Because I'm not sure if a lot of people feel that they've actually been listened to by the agency at this point.
Well, I mean, they did. I mean, they would say they made significant changes, right? They removed the limited remote ID. They allowed recreational drone pilots to register multiple drones. I mean, I don't know how they do it today, and I was never in the rulemaking office specifically, but they categorize comments. If they got a lot of AMA comments that all looked the same, they would put those all together. But I mean, clearly, the FAA has a vision and they're going down that road, and a lot of people support it because they tied the over people rule to the remote ID. And I think they did that strategically for a lot of reasons, but one of them was to grease the remote ID. I think they would have had even more comments on remote ID if it weren't tied to the over people rule.
Comment. I hadn't looked at it that way, but you're right. It's smart to combine those two if you want to press forward with remote ID.
And I think that's a pretty typical thing to do for in the government when they create bills, right? They usually lump good things with bad things so that they can kind of go through. So I don't think that's a new technique at all. Loretta, actually, something happened this week, and I'm so glad that you're on the show this week, because I think this is the perfect question for not only for you but also for the group, because this made me look at drones differently. So let me tell you the story of what happened this week to me. A friend of mine, not a drone pilot, goes to his house, and there is a drone pilot outside of his home who is taking pictures of his property, and he owns the house. He actually is the realtor who sold me my house here, and I know him really well. He's a good friend, and he sends me a message and he says, do you know anything about this company called Drone B? That's all I'm going to say, who hires pilots as a third party. And it's not, I don't know if it's a pick on them or not, but and he says, the pilot can't tell me why he's here flying and taking pictures of my property. My insurance didn't tell me anything. I don't have any insurance claim, because that was my first question to him. Is I said, do you have an insurance claim maybe that the insurance company is investigating and getting information? So I'm part of this company, I'm going to say their name, DroneBase. I'm actually one of the pilot in their email list. So I receive the missions when they come up. And then I looked up after he told me, and I said, what's your address? So I looked up his address, and sure enough, there was a mission right there for him to fly. And when I read the details of the mission, I find the language very interesting, because it says, don't fly there during the weekend or on holidays. I'm assuming so that the homeowner is not at home. If you're approached by the homeowner, tell them you work for DroneBase and that you don't know who the client is. And then it says essentially like hide away so that the homeowner does not see you flying this mission. And I find this language very interesting, and I'm really in a way torn with what is going on here, because somebody is hiring and he still doesn't know who hired this mission via DroneBase to be flown, and somebody is taking pictures of his house. At one point in my head, I start thinking, at what point does this become surveillance? And at one point does this become a job for someone? And I know the flight technically is legal because the person is flying in the airspace. There's no way to stop this drone pilot from flying in that airspace. But I know that if it happened to me and I had someone outside my house taking pictures of my property, I would not feel comfortable with it. So I would like to open this to everyone in this group, actually, to kind of get your opinion. But Loretta, what's your take on this part?
Well, I mean, I would wonder, like, why. I mean, I would also wonder why. I don't see if it's legal to fly where he's flying. I don't see that, according to what you said, it doesn't sound like he flew over the property. He was around the property.
Oh, he was over the property. I mean, taking pictures directly of his house, which was the mission. The mission was to collect footage of my friend's house. That's what DroneBase was hired to do.
Well, I do think that depending on the altitude that was flown, I mean, I think it's potentially, if it's below a certain altitude, you could argue a trespass. I feel that property rights are stronger than privacy interests in most drone situations. But I mean, if he's at a few hundred feet, I don't see any legal issue. But as you know from the Michigan case, at least one court found that a city needed to get a warrant in order to prosecute somebody for zoning violations. So I would wonder whether it was the city checking on people's zoning, whether they had any outbuildings or pools that were put in. You know, I mean, that's the only thing I can think of, or, you know, a former spouse or business partner that's trying to get an estimate on the value of the property.
Interesting.
I mean, you brought up a good point, Loretta, about the altitude at which the drone was flying. I mean, if you go high enough, let's say, it would almost look like Google Maps satellite photos, and people would be like, right, that's maybe not a big deal. But if you come in closer, or if you have a drone with a powerful zoom lens, then I would agree that at some point you have privacy concerns or trespassing concerns. I mean, at what point does it actually become an issue? I mean, is there something defined? I mean, as far as I know, there isn't, but at what point does airspace become personal space or personal property space, right? I mean, if you're flying, let's say, among the trees over somebody else's property, I would argue that at that point you're probably trespassing. Is there anything that helps us understand what navigable airspace is and when airspace becomes part of somebody else's property?
Well, GAO did the Government Accountability Office did a survey, I think about a year ago, and they talked to, 20 or 25 people. I was one of the people that they spoke to. And the conclusion basically is that it's an area of law that is not settled. It is completely not settled. So when I see all these people, as I mentioned earlier, in these groups saying, oh yeah, blade of grass, the town has no jurisdiction, it's the airspace, that is not resolved. So we don't know. And the law for aircraft may not apply to drones. So even though the FAA was really quick to call drones aircraft, that doesn't mean that they're going to be treated like aircraft in every single legal case. So I think that there's going to be, and I think right now there's a bill in Congress that would try to separate what altitude the city controls, what altitude the federal government, things like that. And even though there's a lot of opposition, at least among some of the drone pilots, I do think that at some point some clarity is going to be needed. I mean, I love drones, but I don't want your drone at 20 feet over my house.
and this is where I'm conflicted. This is where I'm so conflicted with this, because I put myself in my friend's shoes, and I think about this flight. It probably is fully entirely legal, but I would not want a drone flying either over my backyard when I'm in my backyard, or even when I'm not. So there is at one point, but then on the opposite side of the coin, if I play the devil's advocate, if the FAA is not controlling that airspace, then who is? And what are we opening ourselves to if the homeowner is controlling, and then you have somebody doing realty shots? I was telling a friend yesterday about this topic, and I said, if my neighbor is selling their house next door and a drone pilot flies over my house to do pictures of my neighbor's house, I don't have a problem with it, because I'm obviously not the subject. But in this case, he or she may have to request permission from me to fly over my house, which is not needed in this case. So it's not clear cut at this stage, and this could hurt the industry more than it could benefit. And so we really have to think about how we're doing this.
I think it was 2 years ago that the FAA released a statement that all airspace was FAA airspace, and therefore their rules would apply. But I mean, Loretta, do you know if anybody has ever challenged the FAA on whether that's actually true, or whether at some point airspace becomes part of somebody's property? Or
well, I mean, the Cosby case that people talk about, that was actually a taking case. So that really doesn't resolve that issue. I mean, I can't think of anything other than in the taking case, which had to do with the government. So whether there are trespass cases, there probably are trespass cases involving manned aircraft, although, for the most part, manned aircraft don't fly that low except on landing and taking off. I mean, helicopters might, but, and in rural areas, you could get low flights. I think the issue is going to come up with repetitive flights. I mean, if somebody flew once low over you, it's like if somebody crosses through your backyard once, you're probably not going to care, but repetitive flights at low altitudes. I think it's either going to require legal cases or legislative fixes.
But it seems that a future where we have commercial drone operations from, let's say, UPS or FedEx or Amazon, or just name them, Zipline. And a lot of the drone operations would be very valuable drone operations, especially when it involves medication, blood samples, even live organs that are being transported. I mean, at that point, does this not become a very hot topic? Because those, I would imagine, if let's say Amazon is going to do routine deliveries, as Jeff Bezos once promised with drones, then I guess you would get established flight patterns, and drones would fly from certain warehouses to certain cities in pretty much fixed routes, I would imagine.
Right, and I think that's what Lee's bill is looking at, commercial routes to designate. I mean, it can't be, drones landing in everybody's backyard. I mean, that's going to be a mess. But I think Lee's bill, for all the criticism that it's gotten, I think it has some good points in it.
So I live in Michigan now, and I covered the Genesee County case because I had a few close friends work on it. And that's when I learned that 16 states, such as Michigan, have it's in the rulemaking that the state can make, the cities aren't allowed to make their own ordinances as far as drone flight is concerned. But then I'm out in California, and some friends and I want to fly Long Beach. We can't really, though, because Bette Midler and a bunch of other celebrities live on that coast. And so each city has their own ordinance, whether you can take off on public property or not. And most of Long Beach is you're not allowed to legally take off. I think there's some rule like you can stand in the tidewater or whatever, but 34 states allow cities to enact their own ordinances saying yay or nay on drone flights. And I'm wondering what your opinion is on that, and if more states are going to start allowing the FAA, hopefully, to be in control of the airspace. I think it makes more sense because it gets really confusing if you don't know.
Well, I do think it's extremely confusing because if you try to fly legally, I mean, even in some states where, like in Florida, there is a general state preemption law, but then it's not clear whether a lot of these local laws were grandfathered in or whether they were preempted. And basically, if you're flying, you should always care about what the local law says because that's what the local cops are going to be relying on. So, I mean, personally, when I fly, I go really early in the morning. So I see neither people nor cops, and, things stay a lot friendlier, early in the morning. But, if you don't have that luxury, then, it's tough. So I think that's why this national bill, I think there needs to be some national rules, although, that backs up on federalism. So unless you're talking about national airspace, it's going to be difficult to have uniform laws for the lower atmosphere. But you probably know in New Zealand, I believe, you can't fly over private property without permission. So, you don't know if we're going to end up going there, which is what's in Lee's bill.
Yeah, I think we have a very complex airspace too, because now you have manned aircraft that fly below 400 feet. We have crop dusters, you have helicopters. So when you start restricting one type of aircraft and you want to restrict another type of aircraft maybe differently, then that creates some inequalities and then some issues. So it will definitely be interesting to see. I think the drone delivery is going to be changing the landscape a lot in terms of the regulation. And I don't think that we're ready for this kind of regulation at the moment. I think everybody's kind of waiting to see how is this going to look like and how is that going to happen in the future, and then kind of be reactive, I think, for the regulation. Are you part of any committees with the FAA to help them with regulation?
No.
They don't want you in there?
I did my
Maybe
time.
She doesn't want. She did.
Maybe you don't want to.
No, I can tell you when I see people all excited about being on like the drone advisory committee. I mean, my eyes like roll in the back of my head. I've been on these committees. I can tell you that it is not what I want to do ever.
A quick question about that. The Drone Advisory Committee. I mean, I've heard a lot of people, me including, say that we always felt that the drone pilots, smaller drone operators, commercial ones, but also hobbyists, weren't really well represented on that Drone Advisory Committee. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I think Vic got on it. Vic Moss is on it now, and I believe Kenji is on it. So I do think that there is some representation. I think really the hobbyists don't have that much other than the AMA, which is, operating from their fixed field. So people like me that want to be able to shoot photographs not from a fixed field, I think we're totally not represented. And I'm not sure if the FPV people are represented.
Yeah, that seems
but I don't fly commercially.
Yeah, I think especially for the hobbyists or recreational drone pilots, it's a big issue because there seems to be no body or no organization that represents all of us. I mean, a lot of them have no background in aviation. They don't really seem to be organized. I still run into plenty of people that don't even know you need to register your drone. So there's all these issues, and there's nothing that really brings that whole group of people together, let alone get them a voice on a drone advisory committee.
Well, right. And I think most people have I talk to people flying their drones in parks, and I haven't yet to meet anyone who even knows what drone 107 is. I've seen people shooting commercially, and they're like, oh, yeah, no, my friend has one. They own the company. Like, well, that doesn't help you.
So how do you think we fix that? How do we fix because it is a complex thing. People don't realize when they start flying, then they get into the airspace, and then there's a whole government entity that controls that airspace. I think a lot of people just look at it, hey, I'm flying my toy up in the air for the hobbyist. But for the Part 107, I find the same thing. I mean, we teach a Part 107 class at Pilot Institute, and we answer questions all day long. And we have a lot of people who basically say, do I need a license to do this? And so there's a lack of education somewhere. The FAA, I think, is putting their best foot forward as far as much as they can, which is difficult because they don't have that much of a reach, I think. How do you think we fix this? How do we get people to understand the rules and the regulation?
Well, but you also have to think, are the regulations necessary? When you end up in a situation where you are regulating toys and people don't have really notice that you're doing something that would require regulation, one of the things you have to wonder is, are you over-regulating? We don't regulate bicycles. We don't regulate knives. I won't get into guns, but there are a lot of dangerous things or potentially dangerous things that we don't regulate. And when you over-regulate, you create a whole category of people that ignore the regulations. And they will, when they ignore regulations, they might ignore even the important ones. So I think that the concept of over-regulation is really detrimental to safety. And I think there should be a focus on, simple things. Now recreational pilots have to understand controlled airspace. That is the most ridiculous anti-safety issue that you can imagine. But I think simple regulations like line of sight. The biggest, danger is when people fly a mile or 2 miles or whatever they're doing out of line of sight. Line of sight is an easy concept to understand. Not flying over people, not flying over crowds. Those are simple, easy concepts. I actually thought 5 miles was too many, but 5 miles was a concept that people could understand. But now trying to get people to understand controlled airspace, I think is really counterproductive. And I think it actually makes the system less safe.
I have a quick
question. Go ahead.
It's very quick. Just to your point of flying a mile or two further or out of line of sight, why do you think manufacturers like DJI keep improving the technology so that, I mean, like the latest Air 2S can fly up to 7.5 miles away, given there aren't any obstructions or obstacles? And so I find that, I've always found that kind of strange. You're not supposed to fly beyond visual line of sight, but here come all these drone makers. Yeah.
Right. They torture you with all those no-fly zones, and then they allow you to fly miles and miles. I mean, it's preposterous, and I agree with you. It's really ironic that we get all these lectures from certain drone companies about the importance of their geofencing, and then you can fly, a couple of miles out. It makes no sense at all.
Yeah.
Do you think that geofencing is a effective way of keeping people out of trouble at all, or you think geofencing is DJI overreaching and being a police officer when they have no right to be so?
I think it's DJI attempting to appease the regulatory agencies, because I think that we really have such limited issues that it's overkill, and a lot of people look to buy other drones, especially I know people that fly commercially have backup drones. I mean, I was out in Vermont and I couldn't fly because I couldn't unlock their geofencing, and I didn't think to check before I had left. I didn't have Wi-Fi, I didn't have cell, and it was a GA airport with like maybe one airplane every 2 weeks. So, yeah, I do have a problem. I mean, I think there are potential issues, and I don't mean to, minimize the fact that you could do something really bad with a drone. But I just don't think that DJI's geofencing is going to stop that. I think bad actors are going to do bad things.
Yeah, I think personally what I would like to see is a hybrid between what the FAA is asking. I think the grid system from the FAA is actually not a terrible idea around airports. As I said, I'm a manned aircraft pilot. The last thing I want to see is when I'm on final, see somebody flying their drones because they didn't know that there was a runway right here, or didn't know that they could be a factor to an airplane because they don't know which way the airplanes are landing. So the problem with DJI is that they're using a completely different set of data to restrict flight. So you could actually be legal to fly in a certain area, and with the FAA, when DJI says, you can't fly. And, I teach on campus at Embry-Riddle in Prescott, and we have most of our campus is on a zero grid, not a zero grid, but DJI prevents us from flying on campus. So it's completely backwards. I wish they would be using the standards from the FAA in order to set their limitations. If you're close to an airport, I have to say you should not be able to take off with your drone unless you have the approval to do this, and that's to protect our manned aircraft pilots that are in the air. But past that, I think it is definitely overreaching as well.
Yeah, I think though that, I think the whole LAMP system, while it's pretty easy to use, I think it's another bureaucratic exercise. I think that if you knew what the grids were, that you could just fly within those grids. I mean, I have not heard, in fact, the other day I was flying with approval in Class B, and I won't say where because I don't want to not get approved in the future, but air traffic cleared a helicopter to hover in the box that I was cleared to fly in.
Wow.
Which I thought was insane.
Yeah, I thought that's why we shared information with them, so that you could have approval to fly there and kind of have the airspace to use.
Right. Yeah, I mean, of course, I landed immediately because, manned aircraft takes precedence, but I was really surprised that ATC had cleared them. But I think, in some ways, the FAA is trying, and Lance is certainly better than, having to apply through a more formal process. But I think that I just don't see that the problem is as big as the solutions. In other words, I think the solutions are much stricter than the issues.
I had a question for you, Loretta, though. If what do you think is the single biggest legal restriction that stands in the way of the drone industry moving forward with new use cases? Let's say like Zipline being able to deliver blood samples and vaccines across the country. I mean, what is the single big old legal hurdle that we're currently facing, do you think?
Well, visual line of sight. I mean, we're never going to expand the drone industry until there are rules that allow beyond visual line of sight, other than by exception.
What do you think it would take in order to make that change? I mean, do we need to start classifying drones differently, where we say, okay, these are Amazon, UPS, FedEx drones. We treat them differently than we'll treat John flying his drone in his backyard?
Well, I think that right now, like the FAA has issued a couple of Part 135 air taxi certificates to drone operators. I do think we need air carrier specific drone rules so that an Amazon or, whoever has specific drone rules. And, it's going to take a while to do that. But I think the FAA is going to be working towards that as part of their incremental plan. So, you need the UTM to come together. They need to deal with the airspace in terms of the corridors. So I do think it's all going to happen.
So Jeff Bezos said, what was it, 2013, that in 5 years' time, so that would take us to 2018, that drone deliveries would be a routine occurrence. What do you think is a more realistic prediction for that scenario to play out? What year would you think is realistic in terms of Amazon being able to deliver products to people by drone?
Yeah, that's really, I mean, I'm not technical at all. So I don't even know that kind of drone delivery really is the future. I think that really, let's say, cargo aircraft, I think that is going to be the future, is, larger manned aircraft. Because I don't really know how the one-offs, maybe there'll be a case for that, the small deliveries by drone. But I think that definitely the major players are going to be pushing to get one, if not two, of the pilots out of the cockpit.
I agree with that 100%. So Loretta, have you been paying attention to urban air mobility, UAM? That's, to me, the UAS industry is fairly young at the moment. The UAM industry is even younger. And I think there's a lot of blockage right now with regulation, or even the FAA. I don't even know how far it is on their radar. What's your take on urban air mobility and how it's going to change the landscape, and how the FAA is actually going to address it?
Well, I think that there's a lot of push for that, because there's clearly, like in China and the UAE, they're already doing air taxi flights with drones. So I think that's going to be part of the future when they complete the UTM. Is going to include urban air mobility. But in terms of the technical piece of it, that's beyond me.
Yeah, I think the technical piece is, I don't think they're there just yet, but I've been hearing a lot. And United invested several billion, I think, in UAM because they're believing in a technology which, for a large airline, I thought was very interesting to invest that much money, being the first one doing it as well, when they're very traditional usually with the way they spend their money. But yeah, this will be interesting.
So there's different drone regulation in different parts of the world, right? I mean, in Europe, we have a different system than we have in Canada, than we have here in the United States. If you look around the globe, is there any specific country where you feel that, okay, look at those guys over there, they got the best system, the best set of drone rules as of today, basically, to make to allow drones to prosper and people to fly and enjoy their drones?
Yeah, I think every country has like something that's more positive. Like in the old days when the FAA was requiring Part 61 manned aircraft certificates, there were a lot of countries that you could look to, like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, that were kind of in the forefront. But I think once the FAA issued Part 107, the U.S. had a lot of benefits. Now, in terms of some of the beyond visual line of sight, companies have gone outside the U.S. to take advantage of better laws. But what you do mention is that at some point, and ICAO is working on this, the International Civil Aviation Organization is working on standardizing rules because, it's when drones start flying internationally, you can't have a system where the laws are all over the place. So I think for at least commercial flights, ICAO will at some point come up with some standardized processes or standards, the way they do for manned aircraft.
But I would encourage everyone to check out Loretta's article on women and drones about important changes to Part 107 as, hey, have you taken the recurrent test yet, Loretta?
I did on April 6th because because I had lost the currency when they, I guess March 1st, because I took advantage of the 6-month waiver that the FAA had. So I haven't been able to fly under 107. So yeah, I took it April 6th.
What are your thoughts on? Do you think it's enough to prepare people for night operations? Does it sufficiently? Because I'm going to take it this weekend, and I'm just wondering, like, do you think it sufficiently covers flight operations at night and everything else that a pilot needs to know?
I mean, since there's no practical aspect to it, I thought it was enough. I think that the main emphasis is on limiting your area of operation and having, the lights that are required. And I think those are the most important thing. I mean, at night, you can't fly as far without becoming disoriented. So I think those are the things to focus on. I thought it was enough. I thought there was a little too much detail on some things, but I thought it was great.
All right, I'm doing it this weekend, so I was just curious.
Kara, we have a free night drone training module that's available that goes into more detail on what the FAA does. So for those of you listening, Pilot Institute, I put that together before the FAA put their training together, but I added a few more things that the FAA doesn't mention. That's not required by law, but it's good if you're going to operate at night, so it should help.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm terrible at night because, I just go up, take a picture, come down. Because, under recreational rules, you could fly at night. But, I find it very difficult to know what I'm doing at night.
It can be disorienting. I did a photo. It was just on the cusp of 30 minutes after the sun set. So I was still in regulatory times. But it's easy to get disoriented. And I'd be curious as to what people think are the best lights to attach to their drones, depending on the size. Because, you have all these smaller consumer drones coming out. it's easy for me to put a LumiCube on a Phantom 4 Pro, but I feel like major manufacturers like DJI keep making them smaller and smaller, more compact. So
I'll send you another link, Kara. I'll send you a link. I did a test. Yeah, I tested seven of them.
Okay, yeah, link it here. Link it on the podcast too, because I think a lot of people want to know. It's easy for me to figure out the Phantom 4 Pro stuff, but as drones get smaller and more compact, I'm just curious to know.
Yeah, we tested 7 of them and tested them for 3 mile. Make sure they were visible from 3 miles. So one of them was a clear winner. So I'll put the link down there. Haye, go ahead.
Okay, hey. Oh, go ahead, Haye.
Yeah, I got one more question. We touched upon this earlier in the podcast briefly about the number of registrations having dropped with the FAA. So actually, I wrote an article or posted an article about that this morning. That it's 27% down for 107 pilots and about 60% down for recreational pilots. And we know from talking to people and also the readers commenting on articles that when it comes to remote ID, a lot of people are also not planning to comply with the FAA rules. And it makes you wonder, like the FAA as an organization, what kind of tools do they have to enforce the rules that they come up with? I mean, how are they going to check and make sure that people actually follow those rules and are in compliance with those rules?
Well, yeah, that's the thing. The FAA has a very small staff. But what usually happens is that there's an incident or an accident, and that's what brings scrutiny. And the registration rule has a criminal law that's related to it. So not registering your drone is a crime, whereas, not having remote ID is not going to be a crime. So usually, nobody knows that your drone isn't registered. But if something happens and the FAA investigates, like I think you're probably aware of the guy who was harassing the fire department, I think in like North Carolina or something. Anyway, there was a drone the drone wasn't registered, and the U.S. attorney took the case, and one of the bases for the prosecution is that it wasn't registered. So that most of the registration cases have been related to like people dropping drugs in jails. So, it hasn't been just walking down the street checking to see who's registered, but you can see a situation where a drone lands in the middle of a crowd and it's not registered, and then the U.S. attorney would conceivably prosecute for the unregistered drone because it's an easy prosecution. But so that's the risk.
Yeah. So if that drone had been registered in your example, then the options would have been limited to prosecute a pilot like that.
Well, I mean, I maybe harassing people with drones could be a criminal act, whatever he was doing. There may have been other things, but a lot of times not having registered the drone. Also, not flying. See, a lot of people don't realize that not flying or flying without a Part 107 certificate, when a Part 107 certificate is required, could also be a criminal violation, just like with pilots. So as long as drones are considered aircraft, then they fit in under those Title 18 USC crimes that apply to aircraft. So, yeah, I mean, so there's not a lot of FAA enforcement, but when it comes, do you want it to be against you? That's I don't.
I get this question. Yeah, I get this question a lot from students who say, well, what happens if I do this? I said, well, probably nothing will happen until until you crash, until you hurt someone, until you get sued because you were flying without a certificate or you were flying without registration. So you're right. It is all about liability. And if something happens, if you get caught, you may never get caught, but the day that you do, it's going to be expensive and not something that you want to do. So that's the message.
Right. Yeah, a lot of these rules really affect law-abiding citizens. So, and people that know what the rules are, because a lot of people out there have no idea. I mean, you don't pick up some of these drones and think, oh, the FAA regulates how I fly this, 20 feet in my backyard. I mean,
do you think manufacturers have to be involved with this? This is actually something that we talked about on an FAA conversation I was on a couple of weeks ago, and somebody recommended that drone manufacturers get involved in helping educate the public on the rules of the air. What do you think about that?
Well, I think in terms of registration, I mean, if the FAA were serious about registration, then it would require that the drones at the point of sale be registered, or there would be some kind of tie-in to the manufacturers. Now, clearly the manufacturers don't want that because they want to sell their drones all over the world, whatever the requirement. But if you were serious about that, there would have to be some link with, you can't start the drone till you've registered it. Although then there's the issue, as there is with remote ID, you don't have to fly drones in the airspace. I mean, a lot of drones are used in warehouses. They're used indoors. And, you do affect those people's rights because they don't have to register their drones at all. But I think if people dealt with drones in different categories, if we stopped considering 0.55 pounds as the demarcation, if we thought more about, let's say, 5 pounds or 10 pounds and made separate, more sensible rules for the smaller drones, certainly 1 pound, 1.5 pounds. I don't think that, we need to bring the whole federal government into those operations. And and that would cover, I don't know how many, but I think it would cover the vast majority of drones that are flown by recreational and small commercial operators.
Are there any more questions for the group? I have a fun questions for the very end, but I'll keep it for the very end. So you guys tell me when you don't have questions anymore.
Yeah,
I'm out of questions.
I don't know. So remote ID takes effect, what, in 30 months, September 2023?
Right.
Am I right? Yeah.
Yeah, it might be over 30 months from April 21.
Yeah, so it's September. Do you see anything changing? I mean, do you see anyone lobbying to because I mean the way it's structured right now, it just seems way harsh. And I'll say it: drones are more regulated than guns. Which why there still hasn't been one death related to drone use. But do you see anything changing in those next 30 months?
Only if that litigation is successful, because what I see is that there just hasn't been an outcry from people. The security agencies all wanted it. I don't see that the Biden administration had any problems with it. They didn't stop it. I mean, it's theoretically possible that the manufacturers won't be able to do whatever needs to be done.
It seems like, I mean, because Pete Buttigieg replaced Elaine Chao as Secretary of Transportation. And of course, there was a lot of fluff coming out like, oh, what does this mean for the industry? And I mean, do you see any real changes being enacted because he's now Secretary of Transportation? I mean,
not at the level that I think we would care about. I mean, I think that he's night and day as far as I'm concerned,
Yeah.
in terms of intellect and things like that. But in terms of, him opposing remote ID for hobbyists or small operators, I don't see him being in the weeds. But I mean, things could happen. Like if the FAA doesn't approve enough FRIAs and the AMA, goes nuts, or, they start arresting school children because, they're flying and they don't have a, remote ID. Things like that could prompt, some changes. But I think that, the attorneys that are working on the case, Kathy Yotis and Jonathan Ruprecht, I think they're like the finest aviation attorneys. I don't think they would have taken the case if they didn't see some vulnerabilities and
I'm a big fan of Jonathan Ruprecht. I think he's very smart, very on top of things. He's given me a few tips. I've turned one into an article for DP Review. We don't do too much legal stuff because it's primarily a photography and videography site, but I really respect his approach and his thoroughness, and he's a good person to have on your side. And Dean Greenblatt's another one, besides you, Loretta, of course, but
I think Jonathan is great. And if you knew Kathy Yotis, you probably know her from AOPA. If you're a pilot, her father was the general counsel for AOPA for many years. She does a lot of aviation. She probably has done more Court of Appeals cases probably in the aviation field than almost anyone. And they're partnered up on this case. So I feel that we have the best legal minds looking at remote ID from a perspective that I like.
What's the next step in the lawsuit? Do you know where they are at? I know they were supposed to submit paperwork and wait for the government to get back to them. Do you know any more?
Yeah, so the petition for review. So the FAA has special statutory authority. Normally, cases would be begun in a district court with a complaint. The FAA has the authority to go directly when you challenge an FAA final rule. It's in the Court of Appeals. So in the Court of Appeals, the first paperwork they file is just what's called a petition for review, which is just a piece of paper that says, we're suing the government on this rule. Yesterday, they filed a list of issues, but they're very broad. So the issues which they're not bound to, but just a basic overview, constitutional issues, procedural issues. There were like 4 statements of the issues that they were going to be raising. And there's going to be a brief where they specify in great detail their arguments, and then the government will respond to that.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So this is going to take a while, obviously, before we can hear anything about the final decision. Do we have an expected final decision timeline?
I would think in about a year, but we'll at least know. It depends on if they file their brief and if the government makes any motions like to dismiss or things like that, or they ask for more time. But I would think in about a year.
Okay, well, something to look forward to, I guess. It's definitely going to be an interesting process, I think. I have a fun question to finish. What's your favorite drone to fly?
Well, right now it's my Mavic 2 Pro, but I've had it for so long that I am bored to tears by it. And I haven't bought the other drones because they just don't have a camera that I think would surpass it. So I'm looking forward to the 3, which I'm hoping will come out this summer. And I haven't been brave enough to try the other ones because people that write articles about them, it's just never quite as good as the Mavic 2 Pro. So I mean, I've had all the Phantoms and whatever, but I'm happy with my Mavic 2 Pro.
Yeah, I have one too. I like it too. We were about to test actually the new one, the Air 2S. We just get the box today, so that's going to be interesting to see the difference. And Haye obviously is going to be the source for the new Mavic 3. He's going to tell us all about it when it comes out. Yep, Mavic 3.
For sure. I mean, that will be a drone to look forward to. But I think for now, for me at least, I like the FPV drone from DJI. It's like a whole different flying experience. I think that's really cool. The Air 2S is probably going to beat the Mavic 2 Pro when it comes to video recording, I think.
It does take great video. I've tested it out a lot. My thing with the Air 2S is that it has a fixed aperture. I like to adjust my aperture, especially during the daytime. And so I'm hoping a Mavic 3 comes in the summer, comes soon. I'm holding out for that, even though I think the Air 2S takes phenomenal video. I agree with Haye on that. They've really improved upon that.
Yeah, I spoke to somebody in China who does not work for DJI, but has some insight. And they said that the rumor was this summer. So that's the rumor I have. In China.
I wouldn't be surprised because the Air 2S isn't going to cannibalize the prosumer line, but I think it's going to appeal to a lot of people saying, oh, look, there's a 1-inch sensor on a compact foldable drone that with 3 batteries and the ND filters and everything you need, you can carry it around in a small little purse. Mm-hmm. So they don't want too many people going out and getting those, something that's less expensive than the Pro Series. So I wouldn't be surprised if they followed up soon, but I'm speculating here. I don't know anything definitively.
I think it will make sense for DJI.
Those were nice pictures. I don't do video, so the video part doesn't interest me.
The pictures, I got a really good, so the gimbal on the Air 2S is stabilized by Rocksteady, same technology that DJI used for the FPV drone. And there was very light wind at a location in LA I went to called Grimes Canyon and got very good low light and motion blur. So I took a really nice motion blur shot. Grimes Canyon has kind of just the hairpin turn, just really, it almost looks like a needle. And I was really impressed. Oh, thanks. But the way it turned out for a drone that retails, that starts at less than $1,000, I think it is going to appeal to a lot of people. But personally, I'm holding out for the fixed aperture myself, but I can see a lot of people going out to get the Air 2S right now.
Mm-hmm. I agree. All right. Well, Loretta, we really appreciate your time and joining us. Actually, we've been going on for over an hour now, and it didn't feel like it at all. We can talk about regulation for a long time and and make it fun, right? Yep. So, well, thank you for joining us on the show, and thank you, Kara. Thank you, Haye, as always. And I think we're going to end it right here. And for our subscribers, make sure that you subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube. And if you want to leave a comment, that's the place to do it. If you're listening to us from your car, from your shower, from wherever you are, thank you for listening. And we will see you next week for another episode.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Thank you,
so
Loretta.
much, Loretta.